to the live session of Narayana IAS Academy. So today the topic that we will be discussing about is a high seas treaty, and this has actually been picked up. This particular news has actually appeared in both the papers, that is The Hindu as well as the Indian Express. So here what is important for us is to understand what is this particular concept of high seas, and here why is there a need for a treaty of high seas, whether it is legally binding or not, and what are the characteristic features if in case India signs and ratifies this particular treaty is what we will actually be discussing, because recently Indian government has actually stated and notified that it will be very shortly signing and ratifying this particular treaty. So here we will be discussing about what is this UN High Seas Treaty, and it is actually, to be very short, it is an international treaty which actually takes care of and it maintains and ensures that the ecological health of the ocean or the marine ecosystem is actually taken care of. Okay. So here we will be discussing about what is this UN High Seas Treaty as well as marine pollution and conservation, which is very important for the environment perspective, and we can actually map this entire topic to environment for the prelims examination and for the mains under GS paper 3 environmental pollution and degradation. Okay. So now let us actually map it to one of the previous year question, because our preparation should always be inclined to the previous year questions and the changing, that is when we will understand what is the changing trend of the UPSC examination. Okay. So there has been a question which was asked in the mains examination in 2018 with respect to that of what are the consequences of the spreading of dead zone on marine ecosystems. So here the entire marine ecosystem, the threat it actually faces, small concepts like eutrophication and the different zones in the marine ecosystem, all these are very important. Now moving forward, let us actually understand what this particular article is discussing about. Okay. So the Indian government actually has stated that it would sign as well as ratify the UN High Seas Treaty. What is the difference between signing and ratifying a treaty is that signing is you just sign and it will be like India has actually signed this treaty, however it is legally binding, but ratifying it is you actually make it a part of your national strategy and that actually gets passed and approved in your legislative body, that is the parliament with respect to that of India. So this is called as ratification. Now let us move into understanding what is this particular concept of high seas. Okay. So before understanding what high seas is, according to UNCLOS, how it actually categorizes this entire ocean ecosystem, the understanding of what is internal waters, what do you mean by contiguous zone, what do you mean by exclusive economic zones, as well as what do you mean by territorial waters, and what are the claims that these particular countries or the states that can actually make with respect to exploitation of the resources over there, the polymetallic nodules, how are they present and where, what is the significance, all these are very important for the examination. Okay. So before moving into this particular concept of high seas, let us quickly look at this particular diagram where the categorization of the ocean ecosystem is actually done here. So here this part that is from the continent, that is this portion of land to this baseline, is called as the internal waters. Okay. Now moving ahead, 12 nautical miles from this particular baseline to 12 nautical miles happens to be the territorial sea, and beyond that 12 nautical miles, that is basically 24 nautical miles from that of this particular baseline, happens to be your contiguous zone. Okay. And then moving on, you have to see the exclusive economic zone, which is actually 200 nautical miles, and beyond this exclusive economic zone, that actually happens to be the high seas, which is also called as international waters. Okay. And this is your deep sea bed, as well as this portion is called as your continental shelf. Now let us understand what do you mean by high seas and why is there a requirement to have a high seas treaty in place, and what is the necessity for India in order to sign and ratify the same. So high seas are parts of the ocean that fall outside a nation's exclusive economic zone, that is nothing but which extends to around 200 nautical miles or 370 kilometers from that of the coastline. This is often referred to as the international waters or the open ocean, and these parts are not managed and protected by any single country. Very, very important. And what and how much of the composition of the earth it actually constitutes is what we need to see. The high seas actually comprises of around 43% of the earth's surface and 61% of the surface area of the oceans and 70% of the volume of living space on earth, which is actually very, very huge. Okay. Now moving forward, before getting into the provisions and the basics of the high seas treaty, we need to see why do we need a high seas treaty. Okay, number one is why do we need is there is lack of regulation, because these high seas are actually beyond the jurisdiction of any one single country. Okay, so there is always hazardous exploitation, environmental degradation, pollution, all these things are actually happening there. So let's see, high seas are actually beyond the jurisdiction of any single country, and this actually leads to over exploitation and degradation without adequate regulations. Also, if you see, only 1.44% of the high seas are currently demarcated as protected areas, and this also actually falls particularly in this Antarctic region. Okay, so that is why we need a proper umbrella or one standardized regulation for protection of this particular high seas. The second need is that there has been a lot of ecological threats. Okay, for example, pollution, there is actually over exploitation, there is biodiversity loss, as well as significant threats in the international waters. There's a lot of piracy that is actually happening, etc. Next, if you see, by 2050, it is actually estimated that there will be more plastics in terms of plastic pollution by weight in the oceans when compared to that of the total volume of fish which is actually present, which is again very, very concerning. So that is why before we actually reach this particular scenario, we need to have the high seas treaty in place. Next one, for the protection of biodiversity, we need a high seas treaty. Here, high seas host approximately around 2.2 million marine species and up to 1 trillion types of microorganisms that are present. And also, nearly 10% of the marine plants and animals which are actually evaluated by the IUCN Red List actually categorize that at the risk of extinction. So, most of the organisms over there, specifically in the high seas, are extremely vulnerable due to the anthropological induced activities, including pollution. Okay, simple. Next one, equitable sharing of benefits. Okay, so whatever are the minerals that we actually exploit here, and however we put this particular portion of the high seas into use, it has to be, that is, the resource allocation has to be very, very equitable, and the benefits also should be equitable. So here, high seas are considered the common heritage of all the humanity, and the benefits should be shared equitably, and currently no mechanism is there in place in order to ensure the fair distribution of these benefits. Now moving forward, let us actually understand about this high seas treaty. Okay, so the another name for this particular high seas treaty is nothing but biodiversity beyond national jurisdictions, that is BBNJ agreement. It is nothing but a legally binding. This is very, very important, because in one of your prelims examination in one of the years, we had a question on CITES whether it's legally binding or not. So these kind of conventions, what is India's contribution, what are the principles, and how far India has actually transcended or actually gone forward in implementing the principles of these conventions are very, very important. Okay. So here it is a legally binding international agreement being formulated under the UNCLOS, that is the United Nations Convention on the Laws of Seas. The purpose is to establish a comprehensive legal framework for the protection of oceans as well as marine life, especially in the high seas, and these have been the areas previously without any kind of protection. And also the treaty will actually function as in the implementation agreement under the UNCLOS. Okay, so similarly, how you have the Paris Agreement under UNFCCC, you actually have this particular high seas treaty under UNCLOS. Moving forward, if you look at the current status of the treaty, so far 91 countries have actually signed the treaty and only 8 have actually ratified it. And if you see what is the requirement for the ratification of this particular treaty is, it will come into force with at least 60 countries ratifying it, and it will immediately become an international law 120 days after the 60th ratification actually takes place. Now let us actually understand what are the few provisions that the High Seas Treaty actually entails. Okay, so here the first concept is the marine protected areas, that is the MPAs. The treaty introduces a particular mechanism for demarcating the areas as marine protected. As we saw, only 1.44% of the area, that is the entire high seas region, is protected, that too near the Antarctic region. So here it provides the MTAs to conserve and protect the marine environment and biodiversity. These are essential in areas where the ocean systems are stressed by human activities such as the climate change, and this actually will similarly function like your wildlife sanctuaries or the biosphere reserves, where you actually keep the entire ecosystem protected. Okay, so currently fewer than 100 of the approximately 18,200 MTAs are in high seas, and the treaty also aims to achieve the cunning Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. This is very, very important, and what is the objective of this is to restore 30% of the degraded coastal and marine ecosystems by the year 2030. So it actually aims to keep in line with that of this cunning Montreal Global Framework. Now moving on, Access and Benefit Sharing Committee is actually set up over here in order to develop the guidelines for access to sharing of benefits from the marine genetic resource beyond the national jurisdiction. And this treaty also establishes a clearing house mechanism for the same. That is nothing but you need to exchange the information between member states, okay, regarding the sharing of benefits. The next one, there is environmental impact assessments. Okay, the treaty actually mandates that there has to be environmental impact assessment of each and every project that is actually being carried, which is in association with that of the high seas, ensuring that the marine ecosystem is actually conserved, as well as establishing the transparency as well as accountability. Next one, consent from indigenous community is also very, very important tenet of this particular treaty, where it says that the access to the marine resources in the areas outside the national jurisdiction, especially those that actually belong to the indigenous and the local communities, must be granted with their free informed consent, approval as well as involvement. So this actually acknowledges the critical role of the indigenous communities in sustainable marine resource management. Now moving forward, there is actually special fund for the developing countries that's been given. So this will be managed by the Conference of Parties. This will be established in order to provide financial assistance to the developing countries in order to help them and to motivate them in order to participate in implementation of this particular treaty. And also, finally, it is the capacity building and technology transfer. Here the treaty actually promotes capacity building and transfer of marine technologies to the developing countries from the other members, where there is sophisticated technology which is actually involved. For example, in case of oil spill, different countries actually deal with it differently. So here there has to be technology transfer from developed countries to developing countries in order to enable the sustainable use of conservation of the marine resources. So finally, after discussing what are all the provisions and necessities of the High Seas Treaty, we need to actually arrive at a conclusion, because every topic that you actually prepare for the mains examination must have an introduction, a properly structured body which is chronologically arranged with no haphazardous mixing of points, and finally you need to always write a neutral conclusion, okay, which is not extreme either towards the right or to the left. So here the High Seas Treaty, as you know, it represents a significant step towards the global marine conservation. Yes, agreed. And it also ensures sustainable resource use and equitable benefit sharing of all the resources and the outcome of it. And its implementation, what all will it address? The regulatory void in the international waters, thereby helping to protect the marine biodiversity and promote the sustainable development. And every answer must actually have your sustainable development goal, and with respect to marine resources, it happens to be UN SDG 14. And here our takeaway is to memorize all the 14, all the SDGs, and what are all the improvements or where India has actually progressed in implementing these SDGs are very, very important. So with this, we've actually come to the end of our live session with this particular topic of High Seas Treaty, which is significant from your environment perspective. So for more such live videos and other lectures, please do like, share and subscribe to Narayana IAS Academy YouTube channel. So until then, have a good day.